Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 7th chapter of the first book of Kings. In the first 12 verses, we read of the details of the exterior dimensions of Solomon's palace. This is unique to the Kings account. Chronicles doesn't have anything like it, and even though Kings is a historical book and Chronicles is written from the priestly perspective, even in Kings, the proliferation and density of concentration on the details of the temple are above and beyond that which, for his palace, even though it was a grander project for reasons we'll learn more about today. But after the material we cover today, we return to some of the details of the interior of the temple. We also read of the some of the details of what was adorned in the interior of the temple in the 10th chapter. Chronicles does has an equivalent account to that in the 9th chapter, but here is really unique to the Kings and Chronicles accounts. But before we even get into that, we got to review the 6th, which is a description of the temple project, and it was began in the 4th year of his reign. This takes us to 966 BC, and he's 23 years old. He ascended to the throne at age 19, and the project took him 7 years. So by the time he was 30, this was complete. And we read of the precise dimensions: 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high in the second verse. Then there's a detail, 11 through 13th verse. And the word of Yahweh came to Solomon, saying, "This house which you are building, if you walk in my laws and do my judgments, and shall keep all my commandments and walk in them, then I shall confirm my word with you, which I spoke to your father David, and I shall dwell in the midst of the children of Israel, and not forsake my people Yahweh." It's not exactly clear how this word came to him. He is visited twice, at least 3 times, by theophanic manifestations, direct encounters with the divinity himself. The first of which is when he is sacrificing at Gibeon early in his reign, and the next of which is upon the completion of this task in the 9th chapter, and then the final of which is near his end. So this might have been a prophet. Prophets are not made mention of in the reign of Solomon. David had prophets who advised him: Nathan, Gad, Iddo, but Solomon seems to have been visited. The only prophet mentioned by name does not appear until the 11th chapter, and that's when he sort of deviated from the covenant path, and henceforth prophets exist as covenant enforcers more so than dividing to the kings. But what he says is something similar. He imparts the same message that he imparted to him in both direct theophanic manifestations. If you obey the covenantal path, then you can literally live as long as you would like. So my oath with your father David is binding, and all you have to do is follow the laws. Now, this is difficult to do, but Solomon, to his credit, did do it for the greater part of his life, and he has the promise of the presence and the power of Yahweh among his people, and the temple would have been considered the central location of the presence of an omnipresent being. And then the details of which you read of in the next section of the 6th chapter just is all about the interior adornment of the items in the castles. And the main detail we read is gold. So there was a speaking place. This would have been where the sermons would have been preached from, and it was overlaid with gold, refined gold, and overlaid altar. The altar of cedar. Cedar was the wood that was unique or indigenous to Lebanon, the nature to the north. Solomon hired Tyrian architect by the name of Hiram, who we meet in the verse after the section we're going to cover today. But verse 21, and Solomon overlaid the inside of the house with refined gold, and made gold chains pass over the front of the speaking place, and overlaid it with gold. Verse 22, thus he overlaid the entire house with gold, until the entire house was completed, and the entire altar that was by the speaking palace he overlaid with gold. Silver was so plentiful as to be virtually valueless in the reign of Solomon. Nothing but gold would do, and everything in his palace, he had gold shields that we read of in the 10th chapter. But everything, because he could afford it, and I think I've read credible estimates that the amount of gold that went into the temple was the equivalent of $2 billion in modern sums. And he overlaid the entire cherubim with gold. Cherubims are angels. We read of them in Eden and in Ezekiel and Revelation and just all over. And in Isaiah, these are angelic creatures. They would have been represented physically, and this wouldn't have been idolatry. So the essence of Jewish idolatry was that Yahweh was an invisible, immaterial, incorporeal being. Ergo, to represent him in physical likeness was to diminish and degrade him, but the representation of angels in physical form was okay. So they were there, and of course they were overlaid with gold, much as everything else, and he overlaid the floor of the house with gold inside and out. 30, you were literally walking on gold when you went into the temple. Gold was all around you. Everywhere you looked was gold, and it was under your feet and above you and in front of you. Gold, gold, gold. Verse 35, and he carved cherubims and palm trees and open flowers and overlaid them with gold, laid smoothly on the carved work. Every detail, now the carving of these intricate items would have, even those down to the detail, down to the last drop, everything was gold. We cannot read that word enough, and it was laid smoothly on the carved work. The process of laying gold on carved work would have been demanded a certain skill set that was provided for. So the he in this verse is, Solomon is spoken of as the builder of the temple, but he's not the actual designer or actual builder thereof. That distinction belongs to Hiram, who is not to be confused with the name of his king. In the 4th year, the foundation of the house of Yahweh was laid in the month of Ziv. And in the 11th year, in the month Bul, the 8th month, the house was completed in all its matters and according to all its plans. Thus he built it for 7 years. The entire enterprise, the entire project, start to finish, consumed 7 years of his reign. This was his reason for being born. This was his mission and destination, to be the one to build the temple, and he got it done by the tender age of 30. But it was a laborious project. Reading the dimensions, the 90 feet long, 30 wide, 45 height, it doesn't seem too spacious to us moderns, but with the intricacy that went into the detail, it is really that time-consuming a project, and the intricacies of which we read as early as the 5th chapter, at least some of the commercial arrangements that made it all possible, but he did not dedicate the dedicatory prayer of the 8th verse. He waits until the festival of tents in the autumn, which incidentally was the work by the post-exilic period, when the book of Ecclesiastes became read annually during that time of year. So he waited after the 8th month that it was built. So it wasn't until it was several months later that it was actually dedicated. In between, we read details of the palace that was built, and also in what we're not going to read today in the 7th chapter, some of the more details of the interior items of the temple. 7th chapter, 1st verse, 1 Kings, lesson itself. And Solomon built his own house for 13 years, and he completed his entire house. These 13 years were consecutive rather than concurrent or simultaneous to the 7. He did not build his own house until it was finished. This much is indicated by the 10th verse of the 9th chapter. So like his father David, who could not bring himself to rest until the Ark of the Covenant, he knew that it was safe and secure, neither could Solomon build his own house. Now the amount of time that he took, this could be interpreted as being more concerned with himself than with his God. But he did have the priorities first. So by the age of 43, he finally had his Versailles to live in. This palace was a multi-building complex, and it was also it was more than a mere house. It functioned as a city hall, a personal residence, a reception center, and an armory. So some of the gold shields that were used to adorn there, gold wouldn't have been practical in battle, so these shields, of which we read of in the 10th chapter, would have been used to impress guests and visitors in the reception center. So it had a utilitarianly indispensable design and function for his society. This was necessary in order for him to reign, in order for him to rule, but he managed to do so from a lesser palace, shall we say, the palace of cedar that his father lived in. Then he built one for his own after the temple, the house of God, came first. And he built the house of the forest of Lebanon, and it was 150 feet long and 75 feet wide and 45 feet high. It was with 4 rows of cedar columns and cedar beings on the columns. It would have had the name the Forest of Lebanon because the pillars of the cedar would have reminded one of the forest. One would have had a forest feeling while in there because the entire structure was connected from the top. All the height was made possible by the beams of cedar of these strength, prized possession wood that was indigenous to the nation to the north of Lebanon, known as the Phoenicians in the ancient world, but here referred to. So this was a house within the palace house. It was only the most prominent one, and remember the dimensions of the temple, which are 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. This is the same height, but it is exceedingly longer, 150 feet, so 60 feet longer and 45 feet wider. So that the square footage of the temple is 2,700 feet. The square footage of the palace is 11,250 feet. The amount of cubic feet, 121,500 for the temple, and the amount of cubic feet is 38,942. 5,006 and 250. So when you add in the amount of the annual input for each of these items, this is mathematics. It's a little boring, I know, but for square footage, 380 feet was accomplished in 1 year, and 865 for the palace was accomplished in 1 year. And as far as cubic feet, that figure is 17,357 plus for the temple, and 38,942 plus for the palace. And it was paneled with cedar above the beams that were on 45 columns, 15 to a row. We can interpret this that it was 3 stories tall, so the average story in this by the rows. So there would have been 15 of these of these cedars, these beams that made of cedar that would have given it its name, the Forest of Lebanon. And there were 3 stories of them, so 5 by 3 or 3 by 5. Some combination of that. It would have been symmetrical, of course, but the average story in this 3-story house was 15 feet tall, and it was paneled with cedar above the beams. So there were beams, and then there were panels behind and around those beams. And there were windows with narrowed frames in 3 rows, and windows was opposite window 3 times. It would be a shame of all shames to have such a magnificent interior place, but no view outside, and much of the gardens that Solomon's had would have been walled for security. So much in the same way that it would have been better to have walls there, would it be better to have windows in this palace, this magnificent view. Now it is of physically adjacent proximity to the temple, so he was a frequent visitor to the house of God. It was it was literally across the street from his own home. And the doorways and the doorposts had square frames, and window was opposite window 3 times. So we had, what I like to do when I read the interior descriptions of the temple is envision it, paint a picture and a map in my head with the physical descriptions provided in order to gain some semblance of what it is that they're talking about. So I want you to imagine what is just said right there and picture it in your brain if possible. I cannot do that for you. I can only recommend that you do it. And he made the porch of the columns 50 feet long and 30 amma wide, and the porch was in front of them, and the columns and the roof were in front of them. So there was a design and structure. Obviously, it makes sense. There would have been porches on the exterior. So in addition to windows, there would have been porches, so one could remain attached to the house, yet have a view and some access to the outdoors in the form of those porch. And the columns and roofs, these would have been there, and any building, but these especially. And he made a hall for the throne, the hall of judgment, where he ruled, and it was paneled with cedar from floor to floor. So this functioned also as a courtroom. This was the Supreme Court of Israel, Solomon's throne, and we witness an example before the throne room that is described here was in circulation early after, before the temple was even began. The court case of the 2 prostitutes claiming to be the mother of a son, and Solomon arbitrates the dispute by ordering a sword. He commands one of his servants to bring a sword to slice the baby in half, to give each woman half of the baby, and the real mother protests. She says, no, give it to him. I'd rather have him live. Whereas the phony mother, the one who had slept on her baby, killing him in the process, had pilfered this woman's baby, and that's how he knew. And Solomon's reputation for wisdom spread far and wide from there. So judgment would be something that a king did, and in his palace would have been the functional equivalent of the Supreme Court. And of course, it would be paneled with cedar from floor to floor. So much as gold adorned the temple, cedar forms the interior. So the temple of Herod, the second temple, was some 330 feet tall, whereas this one was 45 feet tall. But the additions of Herod the Edomite tyrant, who ruled by the patronage of Rome, the Idumean Edomite, he expanded it to 500 feet. So that is the height when Satan brought Jesus to the tippy top of the temple and tempted him to jump with his paraphrase of Psalm 91:1 in the temptation scenes. And the house where he was to dwell, the other courtyards within the hall, was of like workmanship. And Solomon made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken. So this is a multi-building complex. It's a residence, it's a city hall, it's a reception center, it's an armory, as we've already discussed. But his personal lodging places, he would have been, this palace would have housed more than him. He would have had innumerable servants, innumerable wives, eventually acquiring some 700 of them by the 300 concubines by the 11th chapter, but only one of them is mentioned here, and this is Pharaoh's daughter. The alliance between the powerhouse nation to the south, Egypt, who had once enslaved Israel. Israel had since grown to enough clout and standing in the family of nations to be an important ally through which the security of Israel's borders would have been accessed. And what he did with this one was he built her a separate residence so that she could worship her gods without contaminating the center, without corrupting and compromising the covenantal integrity of the king's worship. But when he got carried away with his additional innumerable wives, eventually what he did was he allowed them to set up shop, and he also joined them in their sacrifices. We can read of that in the 11th chapter. But also of like workmanship, this would have been expert craftsmen and carving and just skill and intricacy and statue building and architecture. So workmanship, a lot of workmanship did go into this. And these were of precious stone, hewn to size, sawed with a saw inside and out, and from the foundation to the coping, and also on the outside of the great courtyard. The precious stone would have been the limestone of ancient Palestine, which would have had a pinkish hue that would have been especially radiant in the sun. So we just want to imagine what this looked like, just all this precious stone. So this is more than a wooden exterior. The interior is cedar palace, top to floor, bottom to top, but the outside is precious stone, so it would have been a resplendent jewel, and this would have been visible from the great courtyard. The courtyard would have been an out yard, distinct from the courtroom where the throne what actually was. The throne room would have been the place where justice was administered. And the foundation was of precious stone, large stones of 10 amma and stones of 8 amma. So precious stone and also large stone. So stone all around, but quality stone and also quantity stone. So there would have been sizable stones, but also aesthetically pleasing stones. And we read the dimensions that we didn't translate those into English equivalents, the metric system. Should have done that, sorry. And above were precious stones, hewn to size, and cedar wood. So for the third time in as many verses, we read precious stone. Actually, this one is a plural, so the antecedent two are singular, precious stone. This is precious stones, a plurality, a multitude thereof by the indication. And they would have been fit to size, appropriate, and also cedar wood. Much of what adorned the interior of the palace would have been there as well. So the great courtyard all around had 3 rows of hewn stone and a row of cedar beams, as was the inner courtyard of the house of Yahweh and the porch of the house. So all this, 3 rows of hewn stone, 3 stories tall, that is what we interpret rows as. So imagine a row as a story, 3 of them. And cedar, and there's also courtyards and porches there. So you do gain a visual imagination. We don't have photographs, we don't even have paintings, and the archaeological evidence is insufficient to capture the splendor and the grandeur of this palace. Nevertheless, there is some fingerprints of this palace that have been left, but of course we cannot capture its literal magnificence. It would have been the equivalent of Versailles in its day. Kings from all over the world would have traveled for the privilege, not showing up empty-handed, but bringing great gifts. Much of Solomon's income came from having this magnificent palace, which attracted royal visitors from across the world. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.